Welcome back to another chapter or set of chapters of Minkus and the Donkey. Today we are going to be starting with chapter 10, and that can be found on page 33 on Epic. Chapter 10. Minkus could hardly sleep that night. He was thinking about all the things he could do with Toski, and he couldn't decide what would be more fun. It took him a while, but finally he decided he and Toski were going to go on a world tour. "Do you know what time it is?" asked Mom as Minkus filled his backpack very early the next morning. "Is it that donkey again?" Dad shouted from the bedroom. Minkus ran out of the house before his parents could stop him. The sun hadn't even come up yet. The air was fresh and it tingled in his nose. He could feel that spring was just beginning. Grandma and Grandpa lived on the other side of the village. But the village was so small that it took almost no time to run from one side to the other. Breathe in and out 10 times, and you were there. When Minkus got to Grandma and Grandpa's house, the water for the tea was already boiling. "Ah, donkey boy," said Grandpa, "you're bright and early." "I'm going on a world tour," said Minkus. "And where is this world tour going to take you?" "We're starting at the olive grove, and after that we'll see." "We?" asked Grandpa. "Toski and I." "Ah, yes, of course," said Grandma. "The two of you decide everything together, don't you?" She looked at Grandpa and gave him a wink. Minkus pretended not to notice. Grandpa said he'd put Toski's basket on for Minkus. "She can carry your lunch for you." Minkus told him it was Toski's day off and that he could carry his things on his own back. Before he set off, Grandpa put a bottle of water, a box of juice, and a sandwich into his backpack. Then she looked anxiously at Grandpa. "To the olive grove and back," said Grandpa, "and that's it. Make it a small world tour." They walked to the stable together. Grandpa tied the rope to Toski's halter and waved the end of the rope in front of Minkus's nose. "You're not to untie her. Keep her on this rope. You understand?" Minkus nodded and started walking up the mountain with Toski on a small world tour. Chapter 11. The only sound on the path up to the olive grove was the click-clock of Toski's hooves. They walked very slowly because it was Toski's day off. Minkus asked Toski if she liked walking without the basket on her back. He asked if she was too hot. He asked if she was thirsty. Toski didn't answer, but just plodded along behind him like she was sleepwalking. She didn't seem to be enjoying herself. It was almost as if she preferred to lug around her weight in firewood, even on her day off. Minkus had forgotten what Grandpa had said, and he untied the rope. "Is that better?" he asked. Toski just pushed her nose into Minkus's back, and they walked the rest of the way to the olive grove. Minkus knew that there was a patch of grass up there, delicious green grass. As soon as they got there, Toski lowered her nose and took a big mouthful of grass. Minkus sat down against a tree and drank his juice. Then he had all of his water and ate his sandwich. The sun was nice and warm, but Minkus didn't even think about stopping for a little nap. There was no time to waste. "Come on, Toski," he said after a while. "We're on a world tour and we still have a long way to go." He stroked her neck, rubbed her sides, but then suddenly, thwack! Toski kicked out at him with one of her back legs as if she wanted to push him away. Startled, Minkus jumped back and saw blood on his hand, but Toski didn't touch him. It wasn't his blood. So where had it come from? Carefully, Minkus kneeled down and looked under Toski's belly. He could see a big cut beside her front leg, and the cut was bleeding. Go ahead and pause the video here because we're going to be reading chapters 10 through 13. So you want to go and pause the video here so that you can answer your questions from chapters 10 and 11. They are put together. So go ahead and I'll be waiting for when you come back. Welcome back. All right. We're on chapter 12, which is on page 38 on Epic. "It's all Grandpa's fault," thought Minkus. Grandpa had loaded 1,000,000 tons of firewood on Toski's back without thinking about whether she could carry that much. Minkus looked on the other side of Toski's belly. There was blood there, too. "Poor Toski," said Minkus, and he kept on saying the same thing, in a calming voice, all the way down the mountain. He wasn't in the mood for a world tour any more. Toski trudged along behind Minkus like a little old lady. When they got back to the yard, Minkus didn't know what to do. He couldn't ask Grandma and Grandpa for help. They would just laugh and say that tractors sometimes got a bit rusty as well. Mikis tied the rope to Toski's halter again and put her along down the path into the village. But Toski wasn't at all happy about walking past her stable. She stood there, stubbornly refusing to move. "You're too good for Grandpa," said Minkus. "He doesn't look after you like he should. Don't you realize that?" Toski stayed where she was. Why should she walk down a path she didn't know? She just wanted to go home. For a moment, Minkus thought about slapping her so that she'd start walking. But then he'd be acting like Grandpa, and he didn't want that. He pulled on the rope as hard as he could, but Toski wouldn't budge. Then Toski slowly started to step backwards in the direction of her stable. "Come on!" cried Minkus, but the harder he pulled, the more Toski wanted to go into the yard. Minkus saw someone coming in the distance. He could tell it was Elena. Anyone could see her pink shoes all the way from the moon. "Where are you going?" she asked. "To the doctor's," said Minkus. Elena asked if he was sick, but he pointed at the blood on Toski's tummy. Elena's face went completely white. Minkus thought she was about to faint. "Could you hold on to Toski for a moment?" He handed Elena the rope and went to pick some grass, and then he slowly tempted Toski to move forward, step by step, until she could no longer see her stable. Elena went with Minkus. They walked along the alleyways and followed the path down the hill. There was no one around. Even the village square was empty. "It's Sunday," said Elena. "So?" said Minkus. "It's the doctor's day off." "Not if someone's bleeding to death." Elena nodded. Minkus tied Toski to the fence in front of the doctor's house and knocked on the door quietly because it was the doctor's day off. "You'll have to knock louder," said Elena. So Minkus started banging the door and shouting at the top of his voice, "Doctor! Doctor!" Then finally they heard footsteps in the hallway and the front door swung open. "Minkus!" the doctor exclaimed. "There's nothing wrong with Grandma or Grandpa, is there?" Minkus shook his head and pointed at the donkey. The doctor looked at Toski and raised his eyebrows. "She's hurt," said Minkus. "Who is?" replied the doctor. "Toski." "You mean the donkey?" Minkus nodded. "But you know I'm not a veterinarian, don't you?" "The vet lives 4 villages away," said Minkus, "and Toski needs help now." The doctor asked where Grandpa was. He sounded very stern. Minkus almost started crying. He told the doctor that it was Grandpa who had broken the donkey. "Broken the donkey?" said the doctor. His expression already seemed kinder. "This is an animal, not a car." Minkus told him that Grandpa called his donkey a tractor on legs. The doctor shook his head. He took a look. "Let's take a look then," he said. He walked over to Toski and he saw that the problem was right away. "I think Grandpa's been overloading his tractor." The doctor hurried inside and came back with some absorbent cotton and a jar of ointment. He treated Toski's cuts. When he was done, he placed his hands on Minkus's shoulders, looked at him, and said, "You're a good boy, Minkus." Then he stroked Toski and told Minkus how to take good care of the donkey's wounds. "Rub this in twice a day, put a blanket under the baskets, and don't load them too full from now on. And be sure to tell Grandpa." Minkus shook the doctor's hand. "Oh, yes," said the doctor. "And you can also tell him that the donkey needs a whole week of vacation." Chapter 13. As Minkus walked across the village square with Elena and Toski, he felt really light, as if he'd put down a load of 100 tons of wood. Then he heard someone yelling from beneath the sycamore. "Hey, Squirt!" It echoed across the square, from the church to the house opposite. Minkus froze. The square was full of people now, and every single one of them was looking at him. Where had they all suddenly come from? Then he realized that the church service had just finished. Grandpa came storming towards him. Minkus didn't know his grandpa could still move that fast. When Grandpa reached them, his face was red and sweaty, and he had hardly any breath left in his lungs. Grandpa reached out and grabbed Minkus's ear. "Where have you been?" Grandpa growled. Minkus couldn't say anything. "I said up the path to the olive grove, and no farther." "But, Papuli, does this look like a mountain path?" Minkus's bottom lip started to tremble. "So what are you doing here with that donkey?" Spit was flying out of Grandpa's mouth, right into Minkus's face. As he spoke, Grandpa held on tightly to Minkus's ear, and so Minkus had to take a step forward. Toski immediately did the same. She followed Minkus because that's what she always did, because she was a magnet, as Minkus had said. Everyone on the square had stopped talking. All of the churchgoers were looking at Grandpa, who was pulling Minkus by the ear, and at the donkey, who was still following him, even though Minkus had dropped the rope. No one knew whether it was because of Toski or because of Elena bursting into tears, or because of Minkus taking out the jar of ointment that the doctor had given him, but Grandpa calmed down. "What do you have there?" he asked. He took the jar of ointment from Minkus and tried to read the label. The word was about 100 letters long and looked impossible to pronounce. "The doctor gave it to me," said Minkus. Then Uncle Vallis started interfering and told his brother to think about his heart. "We were worried about you, young man," Uncle Vallis had to shout so that he could hear himself. "We went to look for you, but you'd vanished. Poof! Donkey and all." "I went to see Dr. Papadakis," said Minkus. "Papadakis?" said Grandpa. "So who's sick?" "Toski." Minkus pointed at the cuts on Toski's tummy. "It's because of the baskets." For a moment Grandpa was speechless. More and more people were coming to see what was going on. Uncle Vallis shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. "Did you really take that donkey to see a human doctor?" He laughed so hard that his false teeth almost went clattering into the cobbles. Elena had stopped sobbing. Minkus looked at Grandpa and held his breath. Grandpa gazed around at his brother and at all the other people who were standing around in the square. He had let go of Minkus's ear. Then he shook his head and said, "Well, if that doesn't take the cake."